My name is Seil Park, Park Seil, Professor of Law and Economics, the Graduate School of International Studies, Seoul National University. I'm very much delighted to have this opportunity to take chair for this very, very important session regarding what would be the most important characteristics of the global talent which will be needed in the age of globalization and in the age of rapid technological advancement. And also, what would be the role of the education in providing those new, growing, demanded, needed global talents? Yeah? Those two are extremely important topics, and I'm very happy to be here. We have today a very excellent panel of presenters. Since we do not have much time, we have only 8 minutes to go, so I briefly, shortly introduce our presenters today. Then we will quickly move to our presentation of each speakers. Then, hopefully, I want to have some of your audience. We have many excellent audience here. You may have some time for Q&A. That would be the general rule for this session. Okay, let me introduce George Hadou on my. George Hadou is a mathematician. He is a very famous mathematician. He actually created some mathematical theorem, very famous mathematical theorem of viability theory. I do not have clear understanding what that theorem is, but he invented a very important theorem. And he used to be the former president of the University of Sorbonne. And he's currently the director, Division of Higher Education in UNESCO. And the next speaker will be Bernard Hugonnier, Dr. Hugonnier. He's a trained economist. He has been in OECD for 30 years, and he has been done many works already on issues related to education reform and education policy. And our third speaker will be Henry Anthony Patrinos. He has been in World Bank in 16 years, education economist basically. He has done many work, many research, such as public-private partnership and also school-based management and other fields, child labor and so on. So he has been one of the excellent education economists at World Bank. And we have fourth presenter today, Professor Min Kyung Chan. He's a dean of graduate school, Yonsei University. He has been he's a mathematician, but he has been exposed to in not only academic world, but other citizens movement to advance Korea into more scientifically oriented society. So we have a distinguished panel of presenters. And I'd like each presenter to speak within 15 to 20 minutes. And if we have some time left for Q&A, I'd like to have to see the response from the audience about your presentation. Okay, so shall we move to?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very quickly, because what I prepared to you was a kind of Sorbonne presentation of at least 1 hour. But I think that all the paper will be disponible for you if you want to pay attention to things I cannot present due to the shorter time offered to me. When we speak about creativity, I would like to mention first an anecdote which was very important in my young life as a young mathematician. At the age of 18, I decided to start mathematics and to become, hopefully, a mathematician in research and teaching. And during summertime, I was 18, I met with a genius of the 20th century, and I would say a genius of all time, and I will keep the name just some minutes to to hold your attention. And this person adopted me, and he wanted me to discuss with him, and we had regular meetings, you know, in the south of France about creativity and knowledge, creativity, education and creativity. And this man used to say that knowledge, the purpose of knowledge is not only to acquire knowledge and to accumulate knowledge, but to be sufficiently creative and free to build your own personality through the knowledge you acquire, and to be, as he said, he used to say, to construct and deconstruct. And for him, creativity was a permanent process of construction, deconstruction. Deconstruction not in the sense of destruction, but deconstruction to be innovative, to be creative, to be imaginative. And this man, his name was Picasso. You can imagine that he was creative beyond imagination, and he always used to say that what he has learned was useful for him not only to build his creativity for this knowledge, but to deconstruct the knowledge he has acquired to develop his creative capacities in art, in painting. And I remember that he used to say, which has been quoted many times, that till the age of 20, he learned to draw and to paint like Raphael, you know Raphael, the painter. But from the age of 20, his only obsession was to relearn and to paint and to draw like a child. And I used to say, Master, so it was useless for you to learn to draw and to paint as Raphael. He said, no, because I needed this knowledge to deconstruct this knowledge I have acquired and to express Picasso's personality and creativity. And this is a challenge of education for creativity and for global talent. I don't know what it means to be a global talent. In my field, mathematics, we are global. It's a universal language. We don't do mathematics differently in France, in Korea, in United States. We do mathematics in a global, universal sense. And a global talent, I don't know what this means, but a creative talent, for me, means what Picasso used to tell me. And just to keep you on alert, I'm finishing a book I promised him to write, but I dared not do it before because it was too ambitious to my point of view. But with age, you lose you get some courage you didn't get when you are younger. And this book is Picasso Told Me. And it's about creativity and all this discussion, regular discussion we had about knowledge acquisition and creativity. This is why I will introduce a paper on the transmission of knowledge through education. And the first part, so I will restrain to two parts. First part, what knowledge should be transmitted. So it's important to understand what knowledge should be transmitted, then for each individual through the acquisition of knowledge to build its own creativity, his or her own creativity capacities. Knowledge societies. The 20th century has witnessed the beginnings of an exponential acceleration of revolutions in every area of science: physical, biological, cognitive, socio-economic, and socio-cultural. It is on this basis that progress will continue exponentially, again, at least to begin with. Whether this progress will have its limits, whether the exponential curve will, in fact, behave like an S-curve, I don't know if you are familiar with that, reaching saturation point, it is too early to say. These disciplines defended and still do defend their own territories, and closing them within boundaries they have tried to make impenetrable, boundaries which are now under threat from the knowledge explosion. Discipline boundaries are collapsing on all sides, breached by the forces of interdisciplinarity, which, after bitter struggles, is taking out new territories for itself and riding roughshod over systems built around cultural and ideological codes. The paradigms of Thomas Samuel Kuhn, 1922-1996. Following in the footsteps of Pierre Duhem, 1861, 1916, and Gaston Bachelard, a French philosopher, 1884 and 1962, Kuhn, a professor of history of science, observed in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, published in 1962, University of Chicago Press, that science does not progress through a linear accumulation of knowledge, but by sudden leaps, punctuating lengthy periods of consensus, contributing to the relative perception of reality by those scientific communities subscribing to the underlying theories. These leaps occur when a consensus on a given scientific theory has been completely eroded, because the validity of the theory has been called into question by a growing number of anomalies and inconsistencies. Sorry for my English pronunciation. The difficulties posed by the fact that such a challenge and the intellectual conversion to a different theory have to be endorsed not by just a handful of individuals, but by the whole of the scientific community, explains why these scientific revolutions take so long to happen and why their precursors, who were too far ahead of their time, are consigned to oblivion. The desire for validation, which is what distinguishes science from ideologies, calls the former into question more often than the later. As with the history of ideologies, the history of science appears to obey a principle of inertia, asserting that commitment to a knowledge system is subject to long periods of stagnation and can only be challenged when its very survival is in question. The explosion of new areas of knowledge and new disciplines calls into question two hierarchical structures through which knowledge is transmitted, lectures, how it is assessed, qualification and their symbolic and economic value, and the existence of a common core in a number of specific areas. Scientific organizations do not like intellectual travelers, those who live on the fringes of cultures, the big culturals and the polyculturals, as it were, in the way that we talk of bilinguals and polyglots, and are always on the move between cultures. The more they try to hide this sad fact, the louder they assert the opposite. Conflicts flare up within the same disciplinary area for ideological reasons, or between disciplines for territorial reasons, in the mad scramble for funds, recognition, and power by researchers who are only human like the rest of us. Oddly, exchanges between scholars resort to the most violent of war metaphors, which occasionally leave the cultural arena and become transformed into struggles for power and recognition. For competition between disciplines is expressed in terms of conflict between the members of the knowledge societies involved. The cost of acquiring new knowledge systems explains why members of a knowledge society instinctively cling to the knowledge they have assimilated, either out of conservatism or because of the impossibility of starting their education all over again, so as not to have to abandon the knowledge they have so dearly acquired. They are the source of a kind of immune system that often rejects new bodies of knowledge. Some new knowledge does, however, find its champions who keep the flickering flame alive until it can be turned into innovations. The prohibitive cost of persuading people intellectually encourages the use of much more violent methods of conquest to establish these new knowledge systems, regardless of what form this takes at institutional level. Like societies in general, knowledge societies cannot evolve any faster than the slowest of their members if they want to hold on to their consensus. They depend partly on how quickly individuals who do not belong to the knowledge society can be won over, and partly on how quickly the disciplines themselves evolve. Small knowledge societies evolve more quickly than larger ones. Since they consist of fewer members, a consensus on accepting the new discipline is, by definition, easier to reach. The inertia of knowledge societies is, however, sufficient to explain the difficulties of reforming them. This accounts for the slow death of a knowledge society when the disciplines are no longer compatible with the knowledge of its members. To counter this, new bodies are frequently created to develop the system as a whole, when the cultural and economic costs of setting it up and developing it, at least in the early stages, are less than the costs of the organization that is dying. Once these institutions have been established, their inertia calls for further counterattacks, for one cannot simply sweep away institutions. They go on evolving on their own, though very slowly most of the time. I don't know if... How long?
Couple more minutes.
Couple. So, towards new pathways in the curriculum, interdisciplinarity must take precedence over multidisciplinarity. Since the brain cannot know everything, it is used to be thought that this cognitive limitation could be overcome by multidisciplinarity. All the rage in the 1960s, but with disastrous consequences, which were, however, obvious to anyone who teaches. For what really counts in the coherence of what is learned, how well the knowledge we store in our heads hangs together. Odd snippets of knowledge bearing little relation to the hardcore of knowledge each of us possesses are forgotten that much more easily if they are not strongly linked to the knowledge that we have already fully assimilated. Not to mention the hidden danger of leaving students with the impression that knowing a few rudimentary facts about a theory can substitute for a complete mastery of it. We have to go quite deeply into a subject to get an idea of how little we know about it, and so that the knowledge thus acquired rests on a sufficiently firm base to take the weight of further knowledge. Our cognitive capacities being limited, multidisciplinarity should give way to interdisciplinarity. We should no longer be thinking in terms of more and more elementary introductions to theories, of assembling, when we teach, a patchwork of bits of discipline, but of mixing different cocktails of interdisciplinary courses. This would allow each student to progress as far as they could along these pathways, enriching their minds as they went along, integrated into their existing knowledge, whatever was relevant. This would mean teaching modules arranged in networks into which these pathways were woven. It would also involve a Darwinian diversification of the pathways, which would do away with the idea of national qualification, even international ones, which are just more obstacles blocking a diversified education. I'm just finishing. What should be taught and to whom? Everything, but to everybody. As each brain is only capable of learning a minute amount of the knowledge and skills available to it, The basic problem can be formulated in the following terms: to teach the whole body of knowledge to the whole of the student population, dividing it up into a wide variety of coherent pathways of knowledge in amounts capable of being assimilated by a human brain. Education, the central factor on which everything else more or less directly depends, must target all young people and even the entire population within the framework of recurrent education, misleadingly labeled permanent. The coherence of an individual's knowledge must be compatible with the sum of all collective forms of knowledge. Thank you. I shortened my discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Hadou. Actually, Dr. Hadou's presentation remind me what the Professor Robert Rush was once the Minister of Labor in the United States. In his book, I remember, the Work of Nations, he said that there are two very important talents which might be needed seriously in the age of globalization. One is the capacity for system thinking, the importance of system thinking, and the other one is the abstraction capacity, how you can go. Yeah, that's what this...
I had no time, but it was the following.
Right. Okay. The importance of abstraction capacity, yes, and also the importance of systematic thinking, system thinking, yeah, will be become more and more important in the age of globalizations. We have to make some meaning out of different things and connect each other, trying to mean. Yeah, that's what this Dr. Hadou wants to say in his presentation. But he prepared a long paper, but unfortunately we did not have time to hear his paper, but it will be distributed later, so you can have a chance to see in detail about what he wants to present in his paper. Okay, next speaker is Dr. Hugo. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is a great pleasure and a great honor to be with you today. And I would like to thank the organizers to give the opportunity to the OECD to make this presentation. We've been asked to try to identify the skills for the 21st century. And as you can understand, it is a very difficult task. We are just at the beginning of the 21st century, only 9 years. And 91 years remain to go before we are at the end of this century. And certainly by the end of the century, you would know better what the skills of the 21st century are. An analogy, if you were at the beginning of the 20th century and you were asked what are the skills for the 20th century, certainly it would have been extremely difficult for you to determine that after an agriculture-based economy, some of the major economies in the world would move to an industry-based economy and then to a service-based economy, and therefore that the skills would have to change drastically. We don't have any survey yet of the skills, knowledge, and competencies that are needed for this century. We are going to be equipped very soon at the OECD with two major surveys, one on the skills of adults. This is a program called Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, PIAC. We've been working for the past 5 years on this program, and we expect to have the first results for the skills of the 16 to 65 in 2013, in 4 years from now. Therefore, this program would have taken more than 9 years. Additionally, we are going to work on learning outcomes at the higher education level. It's called Hadou, Assessment of Higher Education Learning Outcomes. We've been working for the past 3 years on this, and we expect to work more than 3 or 4 years before we can produce any results. So the work that we've done is basically analytical, and we tried to identify some of the skills, not all of them, and possibly what I'm presenting you is tentative, possibly speculative, because really we don't know what those skills would be. But we've been identifying some dynamic skills for environmental awareness, skills for lifelong learning, skills for the knowledge economy, ICT skills, certainly, skills for endogenous development, and skills for social capital. I would like to expand on all of them very rapidly. The first one, we call that dynamic skills because we think that it is quite important for students now to be expected to discover what the problems are and study the solution, discover the solution by themselves. And the skills that they need are certainly to take initiative, the capacity to discern the relevant dimensions of a situation, independence, commitment, and readiness to accept responsibility. As you can see, those skills are not cognitive skills. They are non-cognitive skills. They are generic skills, social skills, and therefore they are extremely difficult to be taught, something that I would come back later at the end in my conclusion. The skills for lifelong learning. Lifelong learning for all requires non-cognitive skills such as flexibility and adaptability, mobility, creative and critical thinking, motivation to learn and to relearn, capacity to learn independently, digital literacy, and ability to develop networking. What we are thinking here is that lifelong learning is not just continuing education when you are adult. It means being educated all during your life, from cradle to grave. You are a constant learner, in a way. And therefore, you need to be equipped with some special skills based on values and attitudes, adapting you to the new situation, flexibility and adaptability, being mobile, to be ready to accept new situations, creative and critical thinking, something that George Hadou had just covered in his presentation, motivation to learn, but also to relearn, and the capacity to learn by yourself, and therefore you need to have some digital literacy and the ability to develop networking, which is so important in our days. Skills for the knowledge society, you need interpersonal skills such as teamwork, ability to collaborate in pursuit of a common objective, leadership capabilities, effective communications, and intrapersonal skills, you need motivation, ability to learn, problem solving, entrepreneurship, and analytical skills. All those skills, again, are generic skills. They are not cognitive skills, and again, they are social skills that are very difficult to acquire, and certainly very difficult to measure. How can you measure whether someone is highly motivated or has some effective communication skills? Well, if you look, for instance, at this question of problem solving, we have in our PISA program made a distinction between gender differences, and you can see that in more than 20 countries, females are performing better as far as problem solving is concerned, and that males are performing better in only 15 countries. So it makes a lot of difference, and you can see that not all people, not all students, not all kids are equipped similarly to resolve problems. ICT skills. The context, well, the question is high investment, is it, but low use. In fact, if you look at the horizontal axis, you will see the lower secondary schools with broadband access, and you see on the right-hand side that you have some countries which are very well equipped in broadband access. And yet, they have quite a low utilization rate, as you can see on the vertical axis. In fact, you have countries like the Netherlands, which is very well equipped, but it has a level of utilization which is similar to the one that you have in Greece, for instance, where you have a very low broadband access. And therefore, high investment but low use, this is a tendency that we note in many countries. And therefore, what we can see also is that ICTs are everywhere except in education. If you look at this graph, you would see that in more than 20 countries, the rate of utilization by students is lower than 50%. So therefore, you can see that ICT is everywhere, but not in education. The situation is slightly better if you look at the rate of utilizations by teachers, but yet it's not that high. Now, if you look at the common classroom activities, that is, to what extent ICT is used, well, the traditional way to teach is copy from the board of a book, more than 52%, which is not a very modern way to teach and to learn. And the work on a computer is only used by 60% of the respondents. But at the same time, if you ask the same question, but what is your preferred way to learn, you can see that computers is coming at the fourth position with 31%. And therefore, you have this situation where you don't use much computer at school, but most of the time this is required by the students. Now the question is it because you are using a computer at home that you are having a good performance? And this is quite interesting because this is the fact. On the left-hand side, you have the best performing countries like Finland and Japan and Korea. And you see that in those countries, you have the highest frequency use of computers. And similarly, if you look at the lower performing countries, on the right-hand side, you see that they are not using to some extent computers. But this is the use at home. I can skip that one. If you look at the same diagram, but this time the use of computers at schools, in schools, well, in that case, you don't see any evident relationship between performance and the use of schools. And therefore, the question is, I can skip that one too. The question is it worth raising ICT use in school? Does it raise teaching and learning efficacy? Does it pay off financially? Does it pay off in terms of equity? And therefore, those are the questions that we are trying to answer in a specific program we have at the OECD, which is called the New Millennium Learners, a very good title indeed. Skills for endogenous development. We all know that we need to rely more and more on local development, and local development is based on local assets, such as traditions, cultures, arts and crafts, local know-how, landscapes, historic heritage. And what it is very important is for education to make sure that people are going to know how important it is to preserve, those assets and how to value those assets at the same time. And the role of education is very important. Skills for social capital. We need social capital among communities. We call that bonding social capital. We need social capital among communities. We call that bridging capital. And we need social capital between institutions and communities. We call that linking social capital. What sort of skills do we need for that? We need many skills. We need trust and confidence. We need tolerance. We need solidarity. We need cooperative spirit. We need civic participation, and we need social responsibilities. Again, generic skills, very important skills, social skills, again, which are based on values and attitudes, and most of the time they are not taught at all at school. And education can certainly play a very important role in this area. I can skip that. To conclude, today we need a new vision of education, a new vision of skills, and not only students, but all people of all age have nowadays a more important role to play in the society and in the economy. And they should be more aware of the main challenges and threats the world and our future are facing, as indicated by Mr. Schroeder yesterday. Their skills and competencies have to be profoundly adjusted. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Hugo. Thank you for your very, very informative and comprehensive presentation, and thank you for your effort to adhere to the time limit. Sorry for that. Let's move to the next speaker. Let's welcome Dr. Patrionos.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up on Dr. Hugonier's presentation. Assuming we knew the skills that are required, the question then becomes, how do we ensure that countries are providing those skills to students? And the starting point is, I'll be talking about a report that the bank recently published, which I co-authored, on public-private partnerships in education and their role in improving access to education, the quality of education. We heard yesterday, and we all know of the challenge that many low-income and middle-income countries have to ensure access to education for all the population. There are still too many children out of school, and at the same time that countries are dealing with the access question, the quality of education or academic achievement is more important now than it ever was. So there's a double challenge for many low-income and middle-income countries to both improve access to education and ensure a higher quality of schooling. Over the last couple of decades, an interesting development has occurred. Let me skip to the enrollments. Over the last couple of decades, there's been a tremendous increase in educational access. Most of this access has been in public schools, but the rate of growth of private enrollments has outpaced significantly public school enrollments. And this is true in all regions of the world, particularly in countries where the level of enrollment has been quite low. The increase in access to schooling through the private sector has grown tremendously. And this gives an opportunity for more providers, more supply of education, which can help achieve the goals that countries have of getting children in school and rapidly improving the quality of education. It's clear in our analysis that government is the most important player in access to basic education, and the reasons for government's involvement in education are clear. I list a few that economists and others have used. Perhaps the most important is the question of externalities. There are many social benefits to education that individuals left to their own may not invest enough in their own education to benefit society. Also, the access to finance would limit many low-income families from access to education. So clear rationale for government to be involved, especially at basic education or compulsory level of education. But governments have different instruments at their disposal to help them achieve these important public goals. Ownership of schools and the delivery, direct delivery of education is but one of those instruments. Funding is key. Governments can finance public schools. They can also finance individuals and their families, as many countries do, Korea being one important example. Also, governments regulate education, whether it's public or private, and governments can provide information to society about schools. So there's different ways that government can use these instruments to improve the level of education and improve the quality of learning. In our analysis, we look at the different combinations of public finance and provision, both private and public. We focus on the private provision with public funding, so-called vouchers, contract schools, charter schools, contracting out public services. This is the area that gets the most public policy attention. It's the area where we have more evidence, and perhaps there's a lot of examples, useful examples, both positive and negative, that can help countries achieve a better mix of finance and provision in the education systems. In our analysis, we see a continuum of both choice, provision, and financing, and we try to categorize the different levels of engagement with the private sector. There are still a few countries where there is no real private sector, it doesn't exist at all. Very few of those countries. In most countries, there are private schools. Usually, they cater to the wealthy or the elites of society. Other countries have experimented with giving subsidies to private schools. Our analysis is more on the formal or implicit contracts between governments and families, between governments and private providers. So having contracts with private schools to educate a number of children would be one such contract. Providing scholarships to students that could attend any school, private or public, is another form of contracts. And then a more integrated model where provision of education is left to society and the market. Government finances all education, and families choose those schools. So these different characteristics we see in different countries may affect more people or less of the population. So a country like Bangladesh, we categorize the kind of emerging public-private partnership, but private schools cater to the majority of students at the basic education level. The Philippines has formal programs of support to private schools, and they cover about 9% of the secondary school population. The U.S. Gets the most attention in terms of public-private partnerships. Vouchers, charter schools are in the news, in the press, in academic literature, but in fact, only 5% of students in the United States are educated through vouchers or charter schools. The Netherlands presents a very different model of education where all education, public or private, is financed by government, and families and students can choose any school they wish. In our report, we found evidence of 92 public-private partnership programs in education in 47 countries. We then looked at the evidence base, and we tried to have very strong criteria of what we considered evidence, and this limits our sample considerably. But there are a lot of PPPs, of these contractual forms of engagement with the private sector all over the world. The benefits of engaging with the private sector have been argued in many fora. There's a huge literature, theoretical literature about the benefits of engaging the private sector. One of the arguments often made is that efficiency of education would improve. Access to schooling would improve, the quality of schooling would improve, and the cost of education would be lower than if it was all provided by the public sector. Other arguments about improving the delivery of service to the private sector, skills could be obtained from the private sector that don't exist in the civil service. Perhaps the most important reason for engaging with the private sector in some countries is to overcome restrictions in the hiring and firing of personnel. There are many concerns with engaging with the private sector. The most important one perhaps is the fear of privatizing the education system. Remember, I'm talking about public-private partnerships, but still people argue that PPPs would be one first step towards privatizing education systems. The other fear is that left alone, the market would result in segregation of schools where the better off have access to better schools, while poor students are left behind in a declining education system. Our point of view on this was that these were important but empirical questions, and the conclusions about what works, what should be considered in a country should depend on what works based on evidence. And then this brings us to an important question about how to evaluate these programs. Most of these programs were not designed to be evaluated, at least not rigorously. So we have a lot of programs, but relatively less evidence on their effectiveness. So we had a very strict criteria for selecting studies that we would analyze and consider part of the evidence base, and this led us to a much smaller sample. So instead of 90-some programs, we have 23 programs that have been evaluated rigorously. Instead of 47 countries, we have 9 countries. So there's a lot out there, but we don't know a lot about these programs. I summarized, there's a report that's available, and I'm happy to send this to whoever is interested. There's also paper I prepared for the conference that I'm sure you'll have access to. I tried to summarize the evidence base very quickly. On the so-called voucher programs, there are some very good studies, not enough. Too many of them cover the same countries. You'll see on this list, for example, that Chile has a number of studies and very mixed evidence about the effectiveness of the programs. The only countries where we have randomized evaluations is Colombia, a targeted program that was designed to improve access to secondary schooling. The evidence shows that it was a very effective program and raised student test scores over time. And Korea is another country where there's a lottery used in some cities to allocate students to secondary schools, which are publicly financed. Korean economist has looked at this evidence, but looking at the impact of peer effects, not student achievement. We have less evidence on the private management of public schools, even less evidence on the impact of subsidies on private schools. So there's theoretically a good reason to engage with the private sector. Many countries are doing it. We have some evidence that it works in some countries. For other countries, the evidence is a bit mixed. We need more information about how it works and when it will work. I want to end with one case study that exemplifies, I think, the benefits of engaging with the private sector, the benefits of financing private schools, and how this could have benefits in terms of improving access to schooling, improving the quality of schooling, and perhaps at a lower cost. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Philippines, a country that's historically had a very large presence of private schools going back hundreds of years. Over time, public schooling has expanded tremendously. This has squeezed out the private sector, but the government supports private schools in order to decrease congestion in public high schools and to keep the private sector operating and giving access to private schools to students from less wealthy families. So trying to improve the allocation of students to private schools. The Education Service Contracting Program of the Philippines goes back several decades. It reaches over 1,000 schools and over, I think it's over 400,000 students today. The program was designed to, as I said, to reduce congestion, but also to improve the quality of public schools. By reducing the congestion, the theory is that this would improve teaching in those classrooms, and also they argue there would be cost savings. By using the private sector, there would be less need for building public high schools, and that would reduce costs of, to government. So the program is quite large and important. It's important in terms of access to education for many less wealthy families. It's also important for maintaining the private high schools. The quick chart that shows that over time there's been a decline in enrollments in private schools, and this is part of the reason for the program. What I did was look at the TIMS, it's the Trends in International Math and Science Study that the Philippines participated in 2003 in order to look at differences between public and private schools. In terms of raw differentials, there's a very large advantage for private schools. When private schools outperform public schools by 60 points, given the scaling of TIMS, this is 0.6 of a standard deviation and is equivalent to more than a year of schooling. So private school students are, in cognitive terms, more than a year ahead of public school students. But these are raw differentials, and we don't control for the selection of students. If we bring in observable characteristics that the TIMS background questionnaire collects, this reduces the advantage of private schools, but not by very much. So 39 points in math, 48 points in science. These are still very large differentials. Of course, observables don't tell us the whole story. There could be other factors that we don't see about the selection of schools. So they still could be that better ability students, higher ability students are going into private schools. So we don't have an experiment in the Philippines to examine this, but we can approximate the experiment by using a technique that allows us to look at the observables and ask the question, what if people with the same characteristics were in private schools? So I use propensity score matching based on observable characteristics to create this experiment. And still, although the differential is reduced, it's reduced a little bit, but we still have a large differential of 30 to 40% of a standard deviation. So still about a year of cognitive ability differential between public and private schools. So private schools offer opportunities for improving quality of education for less able students. So given this beneficial advantage of private schools, is it possible to increase access to schooling through the private sector? We did an exercise where we looked at the cost of public and private schools. The cost of educating students through private schools is set through the Education Service Contracting Scheme. And we know that the cost of public high schools is about 9,000 Philippine pesos, which is about more or less $200, $200 US. The grant that's given to private schools to educate students is 5,000, just over 5,000 pesos, or $100. So it's about half the cost, marginal cost, to get a student in private schools compared to public schools. If all the so-called excess students, so the students that are overcrowding public schools, were to be educated through public high schools, this would raise the unit cost to over 10,000 pesos, or more than $210. By using the Education Service Contracting Program, that is, taking those excess students, so-called excess students, into private schools, the cost of achieving this program would reduce the cost by, depending on whether we assume high or low capacity of public schools, by 30 to 50%. So a large benefit financially to using the private sector. My time's up. I'm going to end here. One of the important points I didn't make is on the regulatory environment, and in our study we found that this was key. How private schools are regulated, how the system is regulated, will matter a lot in terms of whether you get a good outcome in terms of the partnerships, and this is a key area that needs to be considered. So I'll end there, and if there's questions about this, I have the report as well if people are interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Patrinios. You have brought many recent information and recent research outcome. I think we can have some time to discuss about that a little more in detail after the presentation. Next, a presenter will be Professor Min.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to present my viewpoint on the issues of global creative talents and the role of education in this session. The focus of my talk is that we need a global-oriented, goal-oriented environment in education. This one, right? Here. Sorry. Okay. The order of my talk is, I have to see background, global talents and core capabilities and cooperations, curriculum for global talents, and role of government, and conclusion. The world is changing very fast, as you know. So each country and the global community today relies more than ever on reinforcing international cooperation to resolve not only the current economic crisis, but also other global issues like climate change, environment, energy, disease, food, water, and natural disasters. To promote international collaborations in solving such problems, education is a very important subject because our problem can be solved by human resources after all. First of all, we need to make people share truly global consciousness by means of education. The first step to cultivate global talents is to make people think of the global community as one family to live with, and hence to lead them to regard the global issues like new influenza and global warming as their own problems. Thus, today's education must focus on training and producing creative talents who can contribute to the global village as a global citizen, with such a sense of global mission and responsibility. They must be able to forecast the changing winds of global trends. They must have the willingness to take on new and tough challenges with the creativity and a daring spirit to construct new values based on common humanity. Then what are fundamental elements to cultivate creative global talents? Most of all, we need to have a cognitive power and comprehensive knowledge in surviving our competitive and challenging society. If you are a college student, you need to study many subjects related to subspecialty in depth to attain a bachelor degree. Upon graduation, however, you might change your job to different fields totally unrelated to your original specialty. Professor George Hadou, the first speaker in this session, pointed out that the signs are that the new century will make expertise and for their jobs more vulnerable. This means that you need to acquire flexible abilities to adapt to new situations and change. Each student is required to develop logical thinking skills, learning techniques, ability for problem solving, etc. These elements will be skills for lifelong learning, mentioned by the second speaker. In addition, to develop good personality is a key factor in global education. Truly, creative global talents are required to have a caring and engaged personality and open-minded sensibility to get along with other people. In many cases, they are expected to work with people with different social, ethnic, and cultural background. For this purpose, they should learn why and how to respect cultural differences and diversities in order to survive our multicultural global society. Moreover, students are required to have a positive attitude and spirit such as curiosity, passion, daring spirit, mission, and responsibility for themselves and for society. These factors really will provide a driving force to achieve their goals. As we all know, the purpose of education is to help students to know themselves and to find ideals and objectives for their lives, and ultimately to turn young people into adults who can take responsibility for society. In this respect, we have to recall what Professor Harry R. Lewis, a former dean of Harvard College, has meant by excellence without soul, and also the warnings of Professor Anthony D. Kronman, a former dean of Yale Law School, why our colleges and universities have given up on the meaning of life. In brief, the four fundamental elements expected from global talents are comprehensive knowledge, adaptability to change, good personality, and mind and spirit. A couple of years ago, the Federation of Korean Industries sent a formal letter to all universities in Korea to inform that the attribute to be developed in the courses in college education. In the letter, it says that corporations today look for global talents who are ready with expertise and professional attitude, positive values, creativity, daring spirit, and team player work ethic. In fact, the Federation of Korean Industries announced a survey result on expected attributes of favorite talents in a company. The order of priority on expected attributes goes like this. The first one is personality and attitude. Next one is presentation and communication skill. The next one is proficiency of foreign language and global sense, information skills, and so on. In view of these messages, the four fundamental elements, knowledge, adaptability to changes, personality, and mind and spirit, mentioned before as requirements in creative global talents, are also essential factors in our society. Given the fundamental elements mentioned above for creative global talents, it would be productive and practical if we pursue a goal-oriented education in each institution. In light of this, each educational institution must first establish their own educational principles, recognize its core capabilities, and reinforce its curriculum accordingly. In general, we must focus on basic and fundamental subjects, including humanities, mathematics, and sciences. We must train students who have the interdisciplinary mode of thinking that is vital in this age of conscience. As discussed before, the capability to adapt to change for future career development is very important, even on the college level. Therefore, undergraduate education should put an emphasis on the basic knowledge taught in liberal arts and science. Now let me explain how an educational institute can achieve its own goal effectively. Each institution must first establish its own educational vision, philosophy, and concept of talents recognize its core capabilities based on those principles, and reinforce its educational program system, including curriculum, accordingly. As the next step, after running curriculum, it must evaluate this educational process to examine if these core capabilities are achieved in an effective manner. Depending on the result of evaluation, each institution put an effort to improve its education by adjusting whole system. It means that these whole step-by-step processes should be run in a cycle. When you start an educational activity, we have to consider what our philosophy, principles, and objectives of education. This statement is applied not only to each educational institution, but also to government and to society in general. In the era of globalization, there must be a consensus between government and society. What kind of nation our country should become? What sort of capabilities we need? What kind of values our society should pursue? With this kind of philosophy and vision, the government and society must communicate with the educational institution to share national goals and encourage the decision makers to establish unique educational philosophies, concepts of talents, standards of excellence, and find out core capabilities that are based on these educational principles. The role of the government is crucial to achieve success in education, because the government should support schools to educate students in such a new educational environment. One of the most important key factors for improving the quality of education is the financial support. Furthermore, equally important is the evaluation of educational institutions and individuals in terms of quality of education. For example, in Korea, most universities concerned about the rank in the university evaluation. However, almost all university evaluation systems give an exclusive emphasis on research outcomes, not on the quality of educations. The government must make a more aggressive and enterprising investment to develop an evaluation system to check and measure the quality of education as well as research outcomes. Fortunately, the OECD is developing the Hadou assessment of higher education learning outcomes, which is known to be a groundbreaking initiative to assess higher education outcomes. Now let me summarize my presentation with additional comments. In view of our age of uncertainty, it is time to think about work over such problems together as members of global village. In this respect, every individual and every nation should consider what should be its own role and responsibility in this global village. And we have to have a question. The government must consider what kind of nation our country should become, what sort of capabilities we need, which values our society should pursue. We must answer these questions by revealing the basic principles of education. So time is limited. I have to conclude with some other short comments. Okay, in fact, our contemporary society indulges in the kind of perfectionism. From the elementary school, parents urge their kids to attain full marks in all examinations without allowing or admitting a single failure. From such a young age, kids always worry about failure, and as a result, they are not used to challenging something new for fear of a possible failure. However, in order to nurture enterprising creativity in young talents, the government and our society must create an atmosphere that accepts well-intentioned failure as a necessary part of innovation. As we mentioned from the beginning, we have to promote international collaborations for global issues. It is desirable all countries sustain a certain level of education to overcome the problems in a synergistic manner. We have to help developing countries to level up their standards of education, science, and technology so that they might contribute to achieve this goal together. Let me close my talk. I strongly believe that it is this kind of goal-oriented environment that produces global talents, and further, that through it, global prosperity can be achieved, as this Global Human Forum is hoping for. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Main. Now we have around 15 minutes left, right, for this session. So fortunately, we can have some time to make comment and questions and answers. So I will open our discussion to the floor. Anyone who has any comments? Okay. Please tell me your name and your affiliation. And if there is any presenter you want to address your question, please say that.
Hello, my name is Dr. Girish. I'm a faculty of Catholic University of Korea. Basically, I'm from India. So my question is to Dr. Harry regarding private-public partnership. As far as India is concerned, if we see the scenario, the universities in India, which is thriving very well, it's been funded by the government. But the schools in India generally is elite schools. The elite schools are mainly by the private institutions because of the legacy of Britishers or missionaries over here. Have you taken into account this aspect while assessing the countries of private-public partnership related to the legacy or some of the past historical aspects, even though you have mentioned in your slide about Philippines little bit, and do you have any comment related to this in India? And the second question is that regarding the accessibility of unlucky people or economically backward people in India, it's very difficult to join private institutions, especially in school level. So what may be the reason regarding maybe regulatory aspects or financial aspects, but do you have any specific suggestion to increase the percentage of economically backward people to these sort of institutions, because they are very highly successful in India? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Before you answer, I'd like to invite a couple more questions. Okay.
I'm Manny Jimenez from the World Bank. I had a question for Professor Ugonier and your very interesting ideas on non-cognitive learning. I was just wondering whether you thought it would be worthwhile, or what your views were, and whether it's worthwhile to distinguish between those non-cognitive skills that may be more teachable, so that they're more amenable to policy change, versus those that may be harder to teach. Some analysts have said that, for example, some non-cognitive skills such as interpersonal skills may be based on social norms that are more difficult to teach. In fact, one Harvard president was recently fired for suggesting that some skills were hardwired by gender. I was just wondering what your views were on that.
Thank you. How about one more? Yeah.
My name is Chen Seng Lee, and advisor to Minister of Education and teacher educator. My question is to Dr. Hugonier. Okay, you suggested 6 general categories and a lot of essential skills for students who will prepare their future. But according to my understanding, ethics and integrity is really important factors, but I'm afraid your 6 skills does not include that factors. So I'm wondering, integrities or honesty or ethics, or what categories these two factors should go under? Is my question clear? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. One more. Okay. Oh, yeah.
I'm Bang Myung-suk from Keris, Korea. My question goes to Mr. Patrinos. You mentioned about the private education's cost is much lower than public. If my understanding was correct, you may be leading us to saving some money for supporting private, or we should go for private schooling support more than public education. Because of the time restraint, we didn't come to your conclusion appropriately. Would you lead us to your conclusion related to the private schooling versus to public education? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we start to respond to the questions? Okay. Shall we start? Okay.
Okay, thank you. On the question of different countries, we did cover several countries where we have information, and we limited our analysis to those where the evidence was more rigorous. On the question of India particularly, there is, as you know, a large literature on the role of private schools in India, and there have been some very interesting recent developments. One is this emergence or our realization of the emergence of these so-called low-cost private schools that are educating students in many countries, including India, at very low cost. And the attraction that they have in India, at least from reports, is that it's the using the English language medium, and this attracted a lot of parents. And the assumption is these are low quality schools, but they're also low cost. But there hasn't been a lot of research on whether these are effective schools. In a few years, we will have very good information about the public support of private schools. There's an ongoing experiment in India that's being evaluated, looking at the sort of voucher financing, and this will be the largest experiment of the kind. So in a few years, we'll have a lot more information. On the role of disadvantaged populations, I think that was the question, and their participation in private schools. The case that we have that's the most rigorous, where they used a lottery to assign students to private schools, it was well targeted to low-income families. And this is in Colombia. Over 100,000 students were educated through this program, and the evidence is that they remained in school longer, they achieved higher results, they were more likely to go into college, and we have follow-ups up to college, and in the next few years we're going to follow these students up into the labor market. So there is evidence about the effectiveness of these programs when they're well targeted, that they actually can produce pretty good results. So coming to the last question about what were our conclusions, I think one of the main conclusions that I didn't present is that we need more information from a variety of countries. Much of our most solid information comes from just a few countries. They're mostly middle-income countries, so we need a lot more evidence that's rigorous. But we do conclude that there are positive benefits, and one of them is precisely this question of getting disadvantaged populations into private schools. And the benefit for society is that these seem to have general benefits in terms of improving the quality of schooling. We know from another program in Colombia that not only do the students in the private schools improve their test scores, but the public schools located near the private schools also improve their performance, likely a competition effect. So one of the conclusions of our study was that if these programs are well designed and implemented and targeted, they can have benefits for both the students in the private schools, but also for the public school systems. Because after all, it's only going to be beneficial if the education system, public and private, improves. We don't, we do have a lot to say about the regulatory legal aspects in the report, and we think that these are key for the performance of systems. Where we have less or lower results, poor results of these programs is in cases where the design of the program is at fault, not necessarily whether the private or public schools perform, but the design of programs in terms of targeting, monitoring the programs, and implementation issues.
Okay, thank you. Next two.
Well, thank you. The first question relates to the relative importance of cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills, that is the so-called generic skills or social skills that I mentioned in my presentation. Well, let's take a very simple example. You have to hire an accountant, and you have two possibilities after giving the two accountants a test. The first choice is an excellent accountant. He masters perfectly all the technicalities and methodologies of accounting. But he has not a very pleasant personality, and is not a very good communicator, is not really a team worker. And your second choice is not the best accountant that you may dream of, but he has such a nice personality, he's such a good communicator, and is an excellent team worker. Now, taking into account the fact that you can improve their performance, their skills, thanks to continuing education, which one are you going to hire? Well, certainly the second one. Second one, you can improve his accounting capacities. But the first one, you cannot improve his personality, and you cannot make him a better team worker, and so on and so forth, which is making my point. Generic skills are very difficult to be taught and very difficult to be acquired. That's for the relativeness between cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And the second question, where should I include skills such as ethic and honesty? Well, possibly in two places. The first one would be into interpersonal skills. That is, if you have to get into a contract between two people, certainly you need some ethic, you need some honesty. That's very important. A second place where I would put that would be in social capital. If you want to create some links between individuals or between communities, certainly you need ethic and honesty. Thank you.
Thank you. I found this session is really well organized. We have 4 papers this morning, and each papers are mutually very much complementary each other. Dr. Hadou, he laid out some philosophical reflection, foundation of the issues we are discussing today. And then Dr. Hugoney, he listed all the talents and skills we are definitely in need in the age of globalization. He showed us a rather comprehensive list of the skills and talent which we have to educate through schools. And then we moved to Dr. Patrinos. He discussed how to provide those needed talent skills through educational system and what kind of change we may need to provide those skills and talent effectively to the coming students. And he discussed the public-private partnership, what kind of partnership we can develop to provide those skills effectively, and also some other new policy experiment, and also some recent research outcome through in World Bank. And though finally, Professor Min, I think he beautifully provided this rather comprehensive general picture of the problems we are discussing today. So it's very mutually, I think, complementary each other. And one problem I miss, I think we didn't touch actually, but I think it is very important, is that who will lead all this change and transformation we need in the age of globalization, in the age of really technological advancement, who will lead this whole change, whole reform of education? I think that is also very important issues. We may need very strong, very committed, determined political leadership to bring out all this change, which we definitely need to cope with these coming challenges. And also we may need educational leadership in each school, in Ministry of Education and so on. Maybe the next topic we have to explore further, we have to pay more attention to is who will lead, who will create, who will bring out all this needed, definitely needed reform and change in the age of globalizations. So I have the feeling that I think these days, each country, government are competing, which government are more effective in bringing the needed reform and change in educational system, which government are really best in bringing all this restructuring, re-engineering our educational system. If those governments who can be successful in doing that, I think will lead not only the future of the world, but also will lead their people very successfully and bring about really prosperity to their own country. So maybe next time, if we have this kind of conference, I think we have to go a little further, that who will bring more effectively all this necessary reform and change in educational system. That will be next topic I hope we can have. And now the time is up, so I think we have to conclude. And thank you very much for our panel of 4 speakers for your very excellent and organized presentation. Let's give a big applause to them. And also, thank you very much for all the participants for this session and for your very attentive attitude and very active participation in the discussion for this session. Thank you very much. Now we conclude this session and we will move to coffee break.